Good morning. It's good to be with you again. The last time I was with you in our worship hour, we studied the church in Ephesus. And we've already studied the church in Sardis, which these are 2 out of the 7 churches of Asia that are written to by John in Revelation. So this morning we are going to be looking at the church that was located in Smyrna. Now all these cities were right there on the continent of Asia, right there off the on the mainland, right there off the coast of the island of Patmos, which is where John was when he wrote the letter. And Smyrna was about 35 to 40 miles north up the coast from Ephesus. Both of those cities were seaport cities. A lot of their economy both of their economies were very powerful, very booming because of where they were located. They were both major commercial seaport trade cities. And so this morning we are going to be reading the text of our very short letter to Smyrna, which is right here in verses 8 through 11. To the angel of the church in Smyrna write, these are the words of him who is first and the last, who died and come back to life. I know your afflictions and your poverty, yet you are rich. I know about the slander of those who say they are Jews but are not, but are the synagogue of Satan. Do not be afraid of what you are about to suffer. And I tell you, behold, the devil will put some of you into prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. Be faithful even to the point of death, and I will give you the crown of life. Whoever has ears, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who is victorious will not be hurt by the second death. Now, I did put this quick little note here about the 10 days at the bottom of the slide. We studied this in our introduction study, or in our study of Smyrna in our class studies on Sunday mornings. But 10 days here was actually a phrase. It could mean 10 literal days. It can also mean a period of time and trial. So we're not going to get caught up with that phrase this morning, but I did want to add that in there for you. Now, for those of you who have been in our class studies, some of this will look familiar, just like with Ephesus, and then some of it will not. Some of it will be new. So, same here. It's, of course, important to understand what Smyrna was like. The culture of Smyrna was very deeply rooted in paganism. They worshipped many gods. They worshipped not only the 24 Greco-Roman legal gods, such as Zeus and Athena and all those characters, but Smyrna itself was kind of special in that it was very special to Rome, because they actually had a shrine, a statue built to Rome itself. They basically personified Rome into a goddess. And they called her Roma, R-O-M-A, Roma. But this city was rampant in pagan culture, pagan worship. The goddess Kybele, C-Y-B-E-L-E, the goddess Kybele, was widely worshipped here. She was symbolized as the mistress of wild nature, which was symbolized by her twin lions that she would be seen pictured with on the statues and the mosaics. She was also looked at as a goddess of fertility, a lot like Artemis was looked at by the Ephesian pagans who lived there. Both sets of worshipers, being that they were goddesses of fertility in some way or form, both sets of worshipers performed some very wild rituals and ceremonies, such as public castration ceremonies, to honor their goddesses. These things really were happening. But within all of this craziness, and with all of this evil immorality, here we find a body of believers, a group of Christians who are trying to make it through one of the most difficult times in church history. Now, you've probably heard the expression before, never judge a book by its cover, right? And I think that's very important to know that expression when you're looking at the church in Smyrna. Because from anyone on the outside looking in, they would have seen Smyrna as not a very popular thing. They would have viewed the church here in Smyrna as very impoverished. By earthly means, they were very poor. But you see, here in America, we are trained to view things a certain way. Especially today, our culture today, we tend to measure the success of things. We tend to measure the success of businesses, organizations, churches, or individuals by their state of their budget and their attendance numbers. We think that because someone has a large house, that they're very successful. Or we think because this church over here has 1,000 members plus, they're doing something right. And that's not always the case. There are exceptions to that, yes, but not always. Looks can be deceiving. And many in Smyrna would have viewed the church here as a complete failure if you were looking at the state of their budget and how much money they had. You see, in this city, and in many cities throughout the Roman Empire, you had what was called labor guilds. And a labor guild was basically almost like a union. That's the best way we can really view it in today's time, like a union. So if you were, let's say, an actor, and you were an actor in the theater, okay? And you were part of the Actors Guild. All of these guilds had to answer to a particular god or goddess, to whichever displays their skill set. So for an actor, that would be Dionysus, or Bacchus to the Romans. He was the god of theater. And so a lot of the labor guilds that centered around actors in the theater would worship this god named Dionysus. And what they would do is quarterly, they would have these guild meetings where the worshipers were worshipers, yes, but the workers would come together, and oftentimes it was held in the temple of that god or goddess. And I'll tell you this, very little of that meeting had to do with business. It was more like a get-together to party and have a good time. And in particular, the reason I picked this guild especially is because not only was there a theater located here in Smyrna, so there would have probably been an Actors Guild here, but what they would do is when they would gather together, they would gather in the temple of Dionysus. And you would have this throne to Dionysus, or the altar. Sometimes the altar was shaped like a throne. And they would lay on it gobs and gobs and gobs of raw meat. And the worshipers would not only be getting drunk with wine and engaging in all sorts of sexual immorality and temple prostitution, that was common, but they would eat so much of this meat that many historians record that the worshipers, when they would get done feasting on this meat that was used in sacrifice to Dionysus, you know that phrase you see in the Bible quite a lot, food sacrificed to idols? That's where that comes from. But they would eat so much of this, it would make them sick. And one account actually says that in Pergamum, which is not Smyrna, but Pergamum, one of the other cities written to, there was this balcony off to the side of the temple. And it was common when they would have these feasts that many of the workers would be basically regurgitating what they had just consumed. It's disgusting. It's gross. But they did that, and they felt and thought that they were doing it in good worship to their God, or the goddess of their guild. If you were a farmer, then your god would be probably Demeter, god of agriculture. And the list goes on and on. Now imagine being a Christian and trying to make a living. Whether you're a farmer, whether you own a vineyard, whether you're an actor, whether you're whatever your occupant, blacksmith, silversmith, whatever your trade is, there's this trade guild or labor guild that goes with it. And if you were not a part of that, how did you think that made you look? Oh, you don't want to take part of the Roman festivities? You don't want to pay tribute to Dionysus who gave you your skill set? I think we all know what probably would happen. Imprisonment, banned from practicing your trade. For most of these guys, their trade is what they grew up knowing. If you were a farmer, it's because your father was a farmer. If you were a vineyard owner, that's because your father owned the vineyard before you and upkept it. As a Christian, they couldn't serve both God and Dionysus. They couldn't serve both God and Athena or God and Zeus. It was impossible. Jesus says you can't do that. You just can't. It doesn't work. And so, for Christians, how could they make money if they weren't able to practice their trade in a very public way and make their goods known to those in the city? Because you were looked at as the outcast if you refused to worship and go along with your trade guild. Now, granted, not all cities were as harsh about this, but Smyrna in particular was very strict on this. By the standards of earthly evaluation, the church here in Smyrna didn't measure up. They had nothing. According to the world standards, they had nothing. They had members who couldn't work, couldn't associate with any of their skill set that they grew up practicing and doing. They didn't have large, extravagant church buildings. None of these churches did, or none of these cities did. They had lots and lots of temples, didn't they? They had big synagogues, some of them. The churches were home churches. They worshipped in each other's homes. And no, they didn't have a lot of money. Jesus makes that very clear in the text, that they were poor by earthly means. And of course, that would have me ask the question, whose opinion is more important in that case? As a Christian living in Smyrna, whose opinion was more important? The 100,000 residents of Smyrna on the outside looking in? Or is it the opinion of Jesus that truly matters? Our answer should always be Jesus. But Jesus told them that they were rich. You see, Jesus wasn't looking at their physical state. He could see that. But he could look beyond it. He could look in places where the residents of Smyrna couldn't see, where the authorities in Smyrna couldn't see. And he called them rich as a result. In our Revelation study, we always like to go back to the text and we apply it to the age, the culture, and the intended audience to make sense of why Jesus uses the language that he does for each specific church. Because every church out of the 7 gets its own unique letter. They're not all the same. And there's a reason for that. In this very short letter to Smyrna, Jesus identifies himself as being the first and the last who's died and has come back to life. You know, there are times when churches need to be rebuked, like Laodicea, the last of the 7 mentioned in Revelation. There are times where a church needs to be challenged, as was the case with Ephesus. There are cases where a church can be praised, such as the case in Philadelphia. But there are times when churches need encouragement above all else. And that was the case here in Smyrna. And what better encouragement to give the Christians here in Smyrna than the image and the picture of our eternal resurrected God. So Jesus says that He is the first and the last. He uses that title in chapter 1. We actually read a little bit of that this morning in our study. And when Jesus is talking to John, John ends up falling on his face like a dead man, the scripture, the text says. Because he was so scared of what he was seeing. And Jesus will use His right hand to reach down and touch John. I would feel like this would be in a compassionate way. And that's when He uses this line. In the Greek, Jesus was using the first and the last letters of the alphabet when He says the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. And it gives the Christians the picture of a timeless, eternal God. All these Greco-Roman religions and gods could not compare to Jesus Christ. And to me, I feel like that would have held a lot of weight for these Christians who were living in daily persecution. Knowing that Jesus isn't taken by surprise. He's never stumped by anything, by any matter. And I know that's hard for us to see as people because we see the temporary, we see the here and now, and Jesus is not. Jesus has the big picture, we don't. He also tells them that He was the one who died and has come back to life. That was something that no one else had done. Even, we used this in our study this morning, we talked about like Lazarus. Yes, he was resurrected. Yes. But guess what? He went back to the grave eventually. He eventually died again. We don't know when that was. It could have been hours after he was resurrected. We don't know. But Jesus was the only one to rise and to never die again. Nor will He ever. And of course, He says that He holds the keys to death and Hades. Now, while that first phrase, the first and the last, really affirms His deity, His godship, the second phrase there, I think really paints a little bit more of a picture. I think it kind of bears witness to both His deity and His humanity. Reaffirming again that He was once, that He was man. He lived among us. Hebrews chapter 4 verse 15, the Hebrew writer tells us that Christ can sympathize with us because of that very fact. It says, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who is in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. At the same time, the fact that Christ conquered death by His resurrection guaranteed their ultimate victory. Despite how defeating their circumstances may have seemed, and at this point, I'm sure some of the members here probably had already met their demise. I don't know. Some of them may have been sitting in prison before this event, before this letter got to them. It certainly happened after. John made it very clear it was going to happen. They weren't free of persecution. They weren't going to be free of tribulation. So, in what ways did the Christians suffer here in Smyrna? What were all the things that they were facing? Now, obviously, financial was a big one. We'll talk about that in just a second, a little bit more. But they suffered politically. The Roman Empire was definitely not, they didn't favor the Christians by any means. I mean, at one point, Christianity becomes completely outlawed, illegal to practice. And if you were found practicing it, or you were seen pledging your allegiance to Jesus versus the emperor, then you were put to death. Thrown into prison until you worked out that, maybe changed your mind a little bit. You were tortured. He says, I know your tribulation, that text. He says, I know your tribulation. The Greek word for tribulation that's used here actually is like, it basically means like pressure. It's like a crushing pressure. And I found this sentence that goes with it. It says, it carries with it the challenge of coping with the internal pressure of a tribulation, especially when feeling like there's no escape. That is, in essence, what Jesus is telling them their tribulation is. It was the force of circumstances that was trying to crush Jesus out of the followers here, out of the believers. And as wild as this may seem, the Romans would have an execution method that lined up with this. Crucifixion was one, but that was one of many. But there was actually this other form of execution that they called crushing or pressing. And it's where you were laid on your back and a heavy rock was put on your chest. And you breathed for as long as you could, and after a certain time had passed, if you weren't dead yet, they would continue to load rocks on you. Until eventually you died. It was inevitable that eventually you would be crushed to death. And it's interesting that Jesus uses that word in this text right here. Because this was happening literally. Now, in 195 BC, I told you that the people of Smyrna, the pagans here, built a statue to Roma. They personified Rome as a goddess. Well, that happened in 195 BC. What happened was the leaders of the city actually wrote to Rome. This was before they were conquered, okay? That area of modern-day Turkey was untouched by the Romans. That was the Lydian Empire for a long time. And the people of Smyrna actually wrote to the Roman emperor at the time, in 195 BC, and said, we want you to come conquer this area. I guess they just didn't like the Lydian kingdom. I don't know what was going on there, but they did not like them very much. And so they requested that Rome come in and take the area. And to show their dedication to Rome, and to show they were serious, they personified Rome into a goddess. And it was their way of showing the emperor, look, see, we're ready to serve you. We're ready to go. That's how dedicated they were to join the Roman Empire. Now, this didn't even happen until 133 BC, when the Lydian kingdom's last king, Attalus III, dies. And when Attalus III dies, he actually has written in his will that entire province, that entire kingdom be given over to the Romans. And that's how easy it happened. It got handed right over. The Romans actually still didn't come in and take the area until a few years later. And the only reason they eventually did step in is because here in this particular city there was or it was in Sardis, I believe, where the king's, I think it was his uncle, tried to take the throne, and then Rome realized at that point, we got to go in there and take the city, or we're going to lose this territory. We're going to have blood on it. We're going to have a war. And so they were able to go right in and take it. But in the middle of the city of Smyrna, there was a statue to Roma. And when you were walking by it, you had to offer incense to it. And it would be right there. You would take it and drop it into the burner. that was located right there in front of the statue. And if you didn't do that, people saw you, you got reported to the authorities, and you know where that got you. As a Christian, you couldn't do that. As a Christian, you couldn't sprinkle that incense to aroma and at the same time serve Jesus Christ. The Christians didn't have just the pagan worshipers around them to worry about. Even the Jews living among them. And while it was common at the start of Christianity for Christians to gather in synagogues and read text and hear the Word of God, that eventually stopped. And it stopped because the Romans caught on to the Christian faith. And they realized that there was these group of people that were worshiping this God/man, Jesus. But to them, the emperor was God/man, so you couldn't have both. But even before that, the apostles of Jesus, the disciples of Jesus, some of them met gruesome ends because of the hatred that was coming from the Jewish side of that spectrum. Eventually, and I missed this slide, but that's Roma, emperor worship, worship of the empire. But even some of these synagogues were starting to close their doors to the Christians, starting to strike their names from their books of attendance, just to disassociate themselves with the Christians and their faith. They were doing this to avoid persecution of themselves. They didn't want the Romans in there anyway. But when you look in the Bible, you see countless examples. Peter and John were arrested by the Jews in Acts chapters 4 and 5. They were questioned for their faith, and as a result, they were flogged. They were whipped. Stephen was arrested. In Acts chapter 6, he's questioned before the Jewish Sanhedrin. And then he was stoned to death for his faith. The Jews plotted to kill Paul after his conversion. In Acts chapter 23, in verse 2, Ananias, the high priest, was so angry with Paul preaching Jesus that he commands the people that are standing near to Paul to punch him. Strike him in the mouth is what the text says. Think of how much hatred and fury was in the heart of Ananias when he said that. And all Paul was doing was preaching about Jesus. He wasn't doing anything harmful to anybody. He was not a criminal. And yet, they were treating him as such. James is killed by Herod. Herod was a Jew. Peter is imprisoned by Herod in Acts chapter 12. Acts chapter 13, Paul and Barnabas are driven out of Antioch by the Jews. And in Acts 14, Paul is stoned to death, or some think either near death or he was stoned to death and came back to life. We don't really know exactly. But Acts 14, Paul is stoned by the Jews. So the persecution of Christians or the followers of Jesus, even the very followers who sat at his feet, were being beaten, imprisoned, tortured, and killed by their own countrymen. And just as they were not free of that persecution, and as they were not free of that tribulation, we are in that same boat as well. Another way they suffered was financially. That's right there in the text. I know your poverty, Jesus says. There are two Greek words that are used to describe poverty in the New Testament. One word is a word that describes basically you have enough. You really don't have anything to spare, but you've got enough to get by. That's it. Then there's this word. that's used in this text. And it actually means to be in a beggar state. Physically, the Christians in Smyrna had nothing. This was a major contrast between the church and the city itself. Because what did I say at the beginning of the lesson this morning? The city was booming economically. It was a very, very wealthy city. But the church wasn't getting any of that. No doubt because of their faith, the church was very impoverished here. And I think we have to ask ourselves the question, what would happen to the church here? Or anywhere for that matter, if our faith in Jesus began to affect us by our bank accounts? How many of us would hold on hard and tight like the Christians in Smyrna were? If that day were to ever happen, one can't help but imagine how hard it would be to hang on. But they were hanging on. Jesus commends them for that. I mean, they suffered maliciously. I know the slander of those who say they're Jews but are not, but they're the synagogue of Satan. You know, we did discuss this in our study, how the synagogue started to close their doors, and all, we talked about that very briefly earlier. But both the Jews and the Gentiles took their turn on slandering Christians. Many rumors spread throughout the Roman Empire as to this Christian faith and what it was all about. The rumor started that the Christians were engaging in cannibalism because of their partaking of the Lord's Supper. Because of that famous line, "This is my body, this is my blood." Jesus said those words. But that didn't stop the slander. They were accused of cannibalism. They were accused of sexual immorality and drunkenness because they would have fellowship meals together called love feasts. Agape feast was another word they used for them. And so the Romans would spread rumors that, well, they're not really in there enjoying a fellowship meal together. That's not the only thing they're in there doing. Which, you know, it's interesting they tried to do that, and yet that culture was all about that. It's weird. Anyway. Because following Christ meant, for some people, they had to give up, you know, not listening to what their parents had to say, or what their children had to say, or what their relatives had to say. They were accused of being anti-family as a result. And you know what's really wild? They were accused of atheism. I thought that was weird. They were accused of atheism. But you know why? It's because they didn't worship statues. They didn't burn incense to an altar. None of that. That wasn't a part of that, of their worship of Jesus. They didn't need to do that stuff. So they were accused of being anti-God or atheist. And then, of course, the Roman authority accused the church of being anti-Rome and treasonous because they wouldn't pledge loyalty to Caesar. They suffered physically. Behold, the devil is going to throw some of you into prison. The disciples were no strangers to the prisons. If you were in this time and you visited these areas, more than likely you would have ended up, if you were a Christian, you would have probably ended up in a jail cell where the words "Paul was here" was inscribed in the stonework. He was in there so often. He wasn't the only one. But these were not hygienic prisons. They weren't clean. They were basically a hole in the ground. You would have rats running rampant, disease, waste, other stuff in there with you. You were fortunate if you got to leave prison, number one. You were really fortunate if you got to leave prison without getting some sort of sickness or being left with some other kind of disease. But of course, beyond this were other means of punishment. Cruelty. And ultimately being martyred for your faith. And I've got up there just some of the examples that the Romans would use in executing Christians. And granted, these were normal for criminals to go through these types of punishments and executions, but since Christianity was made illegal in the Roman Empire, Christians were viewed as criminals in the eyes of the Roman. And while all this information may make us feel squeamish today or baffle us today, knowing what the early Christians went through, they helped to pave the way for the gospel. Thanks be to God. Through believers like this, the faith continues. No empire, no matter how fierce it was. And to Daniel in his vision in chapter 7, the Roman Empire was this terrible, monstrous beast. Out of all the other kingdoms that he sees, he describes the kingdoms as being like animals, known animals. But then he sees this other fourth beast, and it's nothing like he can really describe. It was so terrifying. It had these large teeth and claws made of iron. And it was just ripping to shreds anything that came in its way and trampled everything in its path. That's how Daniel describes it. But even that empire could not stop Jesus. Could not stop the faith. Yes, many Christians were martyred. Many Christians lost their lives because of their confession of Jesus. That is fact. Thousands. We really don't even know the number. I actually looked that up. How many Christians were... Nobody knows. Hundreds of thousands, maybe? Nobody knows. Now, while under these circumstances, it would have definitely been hard to feel comforted, wouldn't it? Especially when you don't have anything. You really have nothing to run to except Jesus. And in a way, I think that's what made the Smyrna Christians so spiritually rich. Because in everything, they could look immediately to Jesus. They couldn't look to their possessions. They couldn't look to their wealth. They couldn't look to the Romans. They had to look to Jesus. That was the only option. I want to share some things with you this morning as we wind down the lesson here. But take comfort in knowing that Jesus is eternal, that Jesus is timeless. This is something we looked at this morning in chapter 1 of Revelation. The Roman Empire and its authority would not be around forever. It would eventually fall. But Jesus wasn't the emperor of Rome. He was over the emperor of Rome. He was the King of Kings. He is the King of Kings. And no matter what would happen to them, he let them know that he was victorious in death and had power over it. Man lives and dies. Jesus died and now lives forever. Philippians chapter 2, verse 8, Scripture, Paul says, and being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. And I want to point out something. In Revelation 1, when John hears Jesus, when he hears this voice behind him, he turns around and he sees 7 golden lampstands. Revelation 1 says. 7 golden lampstands. This was not a menorah. We know what a menorah, the one candle with the 7. Okay. No, it wasn't like that. The Scripture plainly says they were each a specific lampstand. And at the end of the text, Jesus says, these 7 golden lampstands each represent one of the 7 churches that John writes to. Now, why is that important? Because when John turns to look and he sees these lampstands, he sees Jesus right there with him. So whether the church was being encouraged, whether it was being scolded a little bit, whether it was being praised, whether it was being challenged, Jesus was right there among all of them. And to me, I think that is such a beautiful picture. Imagine the Leonard congregation here being one lampstand out of however many are in the world today. Jesus is fully aware of every battle, trial, prayer request, every struggle that every body of believers faces. And he has this close, personal, intimate knowledge of the church here, as well as the thousands throughout the world. I think that's what makes it real special, that each church gets its own speech. Because he knew all of their problems were unique to them themselves. While they did hold some similar persecutions and similar things, there were things that were different in these cities, as we've studied in our studies. But see, Christ has perspective. He told them, he says, I know your poverty. I know earthly you're poor. You are broke. You are in a beggar state. But you're rich. Now, if a resident of Smyrna had read that letter, they would have said, that don't make any sense. They don't have anything. And yet he says they're rich. Well, Jesus knew what he was talking about. He wasn't looking at their earthly needs. I like the text that Ivan read this morning, Ephesians chapter 4, which talks about all these characteristics that we, walking with Christ, need to be displaying. Living lives in a way that reflect the image of Jesus. I mean, that's so crucial, so important. And I think that Christians here in Smyrna were doing a really great job at that. I think that they were so overwhelmed in their joy and their peace and hope and power and love and holiness that that's what Jesus was seeing. And that was precious for him to see. What's really wild about that is it was very different in the last city that we read about in Laodicea. Laodicea was a very rich city, but guess what? The church members there apparently were very rich as well. But Jesus says, you're poor to that church. But to Smyrna, who's earthly broke, you're rich. And of course, he makes it very clear that Satan is going to test them. He's going to put them through the ringer. You can take comfort today knowing that Jesus will handle our problems, that he will face our issues head on. We can take comfort in knowing that Jesus will use our tribulations for his glory and for good. You see, Satan tempts us to destroy us. That's his ultimate goal. Satan is not out to make us a better person. He's not there to encourage us. He's there to destroy us, ultimately. And anyone that thinks that Satan is out to be their friend has a very, very wrong idea. But God has this amazing way of taking our issues, taking our tribulation and our problems, and turning them into good. And that's something that Satan doesn't do. He's not interested in making your life better in a spiritual sense. just as gold is refined and purified in the heat of fire, so our character and our faith is strengthened that way as well. The final thing that I do want to point out is what Jesus promises to the believers. Now, this was pretty cool. We can take note in knowing that Jesus is generous. In verse 10, he mentions that those who are faithful to the point of death will receive a crown of life. Now, what was really unique about the city of Smyrna is on the backside of the city at Mount Pagos, or Pagos, anyway, on the backside of the mountain there was this fortress that was on top. And it was actually nicknamed the Crown of Smyrna. So again, Jesus is playing on the context and the culture of the day. And he says, I'll give you the crown of life. The goddess Kibbalah, remember me telling you about her at the beginning of the lesson? The patroness of the city of Smyrna, who they worshipped, who the pagans worshipped. Well, I put on here that viewed from the harbor, the Mount Pagos was thought of as the head of Kibbalah, and crowned by the fortress on the top, and encircled around the neck was the street of gold, which went basically connected to the temple of Zeus, which obviously there's a message to be said there. So when someone mentioned the crown of Smyrna, they were talking about this particular spot. And this was actually pictured when you see her engravings, when you see her statues, her idols. On her top is the fortress. The crown of Smyrna was also the crown of Kibbalah. Even the most die-hard followers of Kibbalah did not receive a crown nor a promise of such. And to the pagan worshippers, Kibbalah was everything. And even those that would make the ultimate sacrifice by engaging in the castration ceremonies, they weren't promised it either. That was a special honor that she didn't give out. But Jesus says, that's not who I am. I'm not Kibbalah. Now you will wear a crown. You make it to the end. And I'll take care of you. It was very special for the Christians living in this city. They would have understood this. And of course, in that last verse, he says that those who do conquer will not be hurt by the second death. That's spiritual death. That's complete separation from God for all eternity. None of us in this room want to be in that shape. None of us in this room want to be in complete separation from God for all eternity. And what a comforting thought for the Smyrna Christians to hear that even though the empire may do evil things, and even though the empire may condemn them to death, the eternal part of them could not be touched. Not by the Caesar, not by anyone else. This morning, I want to encourage you, if you are here today, and you're not part of that family of God, I want to encourage you to take that step, make that commitment, dedicate your life to Jesus. Jesus is the King of Kings. Jesus is the Savior of the world, no doubt about it. And He's waiting for you. He's waiting on you to answer it. He's waiting. So this morning I want to encourage you to take on Jesus Christ, to be in that relationship with Him.